Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome once again to A Shelf of Many Things, where I take a look at independent RPGs and RPG accessories. This time I'm taking a look at yet another offering from Black Oath Entertainment, who were kind enough to provide me a review PDF, Under Ashen Skies. It is designed and written by Alan Barr as well as Alex T. Available in print and PDF format, Under Ashen Skies is an RPG where you take the role of a person who is awakened in a world of darkness, loss, and horror. It is a single-player RPG with a focus on combat and survival, as well as exploration inspired by such things as Hellraiser, Silent Hill, the works of Junji Ito, etc. And as you venturing forth from an apartment, exploring a broken town, looking for gear and resources, and just trying to scavenge and survive. As always, I will describe the product's presentation in brief, summarize the contents, and then give my thoughts on the whole at the end. Under Ashen Skies clocks in at around 135 pages with a nice black and white cover with gold highlights, a color scheme which continues throughout the interior. With the occasional touch of other color here and there, the format is nice with a two-column structure with the occasional inline image and table. The tables are nicely indexed for ease of use, and the borders of the pages are printed with the section of the book that you're in for ease of reference as well. The art design and selection is quite thematic and atmospheric, and very much brings to mind the sorts of video games that may have once inspired this. As far as the contents themselves go, Under Ashen Skies is divided into 7 sections: of dismal loss and purpose found, of hardships and new beginnings, of personal growth and the search for self, of the broken world and the rules to navigate it, of dreadful exploration and shifting realities, of random encounters and terrible foes, and finally, of fleeting possessions and the means to obtain them. While not explicitly labeled, one can generally get a sense for the rules included in each section by the phrase involved. In more detail, of dismal loss and purpose found serves as a sort of introduction. It begins with an in-character passage during which you awaken within a fairly empty apartment with minimal furnishings and little memory. After searching about, you discover a few basic objects as well as a number of unsettling details that hint that this place is not as it seems. You are given a note with an imperative to, quote, find the others, unquote, and are then left to your own devices. Of hardships and new beginnings is more about the mechanical introduction to Under Ashen Skies. It begins by briefly going over the concept of the game, general role-playing game material, as well as explaining the town of Riverside, the setting where Under Ashen Skies takes place. It moves on to going over the simplified rules, which declare that Under Ashen Skies uses a modified version of the same engine used in the Thousand Worlds rule set. Something else, this has been used by other Black Oath games within some iteration, and I've actually covered the Thousand Worlds, I believe, some time ago, so it's a system that I've experienced before. There's talk about the dice required, as well as a disclaimer that details that Under Ashen Skies does deal with mature themes. Since it is a fundamentally horror-based game, I can understand this. It's not one of those games where I'm going to give them, a little bit of trouble about that. Wherein, this one actually genuinely is a pretty interesting horror game. Of personal growth and the search for self serves as the character creation and advancement chapter. It begins with a brief overview of the things that go into character creation before touching on each step in turn. The attributes section details the primary attributes of all player characters, being strength, dexterity, constitution, will, intelligence, and charisma. These start at a default of 10 each, but range from 1 to 18. There's also a brief description of how to perform tests, being a D20 plus attribute versus a default 20 score. Secondary attributes include fate, stamina, trauma, and wounds. These offer ways for characters to determine what a character can do in combat, and detail the mental and physical effects of what happens to them during play. The skills are then detailed next. This begins with a description of how to make a skill check, which is similar to an attribute check, as well as giving a default number of skills that can be applied during character creation. The skills themselves are then detailed with brief descriptions of each one and range from crafting, first aid, all the way through individual combat skills and survival skills. The rules for improving your character follow as characters survive and explore the world. They gather memories which can then be used as sort of currency to level up or otherwise improve a character. A few tables follow which detail example memories that can be randomly uncovered during play. This is followed by details on dark secrets. Dark secrets are similar to memories, save that they inflict trauma when they're uncovered. So yeah, that's like truly a dark secret. The talent section details the various abilities that a character can use to basically improve their chances and give them special abilities or attacks. Characters can receive up to 5 talents and may switch them whenever they learn another one. Talents they may also be declined when the opportunity comes up in order to offset any negative trait gained through play or accrual of trauma. The talents themselves are then covered in a D100 table and range from basic bonuses such as a +1 to initiative or the maximum wounds to special abilities such as the ability to counterattack, the ability to ignore cover while firing at an enemy, and so forth. Of the Broken World and the rules to navigate it are the core rules of the game. It begins with a brief overview, including comparing Under Ashen Skies to roguelikes such as Diablo, and then goes into basic attribute and skill check mechanics, which I'd already touched on before. There's a section on performing non-skill actions, which gives a brief guideline on how to determine these, as well as assisting on skill checks. In case there are multiple characters with opposed checks also detailed, where you have one character making a skill check against another, and then finally recovery checks, which enable a character to recover from various conditions. Under Ashen Skies has advantage and disadvantage mechanics similar to 5th edition and other systems. There's a table with some difficulty modifiers, besides the default number, as well as basic guidelines on critical failures and successes on natural 1s and natural 20s. Combat begins with initiative, which is treated more like a game state. There is a brief explanation of the difference between a turn and full combat round, then the stamina system is described. Combat actions do cost stamina, and the PCs start with a default number of stamina at the start of each combat. There's a table with example stamina costs for many actions. Combat movement rules are covered, including the option to skip an action in order to move further. Stealth rules are given along with the option to avoid or initiate combat. The act of being stealthy does require some stamina and thus may limit what action a character can take on the first round if they decide to be stealthy. There's some reaction rules given to determine whether an encounter is even aggressive or not. Due to the nature of the game, many more creatures are aggressive than might be found in, say, a standard fantasy game, but, there's always that chance. The actual combat sequence is given thereafter, with attacks being a D20 roll using close combat or ranged skills versus a defense attribute. Damage is done in the form of wounds rather than hit points, and being hit can result in conditions instead of wounds, such as being broken, knocked down, and dazed, and so forth. There are various options on gaining defense against various attacks, such as taking cover or trying to evade, and then there's a simple guideline on enemy actions that can be used to determine basic enemies' actions in combat, which more often than not just tend to be simple attacks against the most recent one that landed a hit on them. The various conditions that can be inflicted via combat or other elements of play are discussed and defined. Things such as being blinded, bleeding, burned, deafened, exhausted, and so forth are each given their own entry. Poison has its own table determining what type it is. These conditions are then followed by special other combat rules such as throwing explosives, disengaging, making desperate attacks, and so forth. There is a brief optional rule regarding random combat events that can spice up combat with a small random table, and then critical misses are given their own tables, which can result in various unfortunate actions depending on whether you're using melee or ranged attacks. Rules on wounds, healing, and death follow, with wounds accrued during combat, eventually giving penalties to actions and may result in lasting injuries. Treating wounds are done after combat and take time advancing a time track. There is a time track that's discussed later. There is out-of-combat damage covered with a table that lists various injuries that can accumulate as your wounds stack up. Death rules follow, which is an interesting one because most times you can simply wake up back at your apartment even after dying. You'll have some penalties, of course, but there is a small chance of losing the character forever each time, so it's not a forever roguelike. Eventually you could get character death out of it. Rules on hunger and its effects are given, as well as guidelines on traps. Trap consequences can result in various setbacks, such as similar to injuries from before, but most of them less life-threatening. Trauma rules follow, which represent the mental wear of the horror of the scenario and are represented by the accrual of various trauma points Every time a certain threshold is reached, the character must roll on a trauma table, which can accumulate various ill effects over time. There are rules for slowing down the gain of trauma through resolve, removing traits by sacrificing talents, as well as guidelines on just what will cause trauma to accrue. The various negative traits you can receive are detailed in their own table and function similar to basically negative talents. Time tracking, which I mentioned earlier, is covered next, with certain actions during exploration, advancing the time track. Each full turn of a time track is considered one cycle, which can trigger certain effects, and may tell you when you need to perform basic maintenance on your character. There are 10 cycles in each day, and there's guidelines to track the course of a week, with each day of the week governed by different protogenos, with neutral, negative, and positive aspects. Each day is then described in turn with its own little table. There's an emotion track, which tracks your character's emotional state from negative to positive, with certain levels on each side giving either penalties or bonuses. There's various events given that can result in your character's emotional state changing as well. Tracking gear goes into inventory management within the game. Under Ashen Skies uses an abstract system of gear slots with different types of gear taking generally one slot, but some taking more. Weapons, bags, and pockets are gone into, which can vary what a character can hold, and then there's guidelines for storing things in your apartment, which has its own gear slot. Although designed for solo play, there are guidelines for playing with an additional player, basically making encounters more difficult, splitting the rewards, and so forth. Of dreadful exploration and shifting realities is the next section of the rules, whereas the prior chapter covered playing the game, this one covers designing the overall region you explore in the process of exploration. There's a set of steps to gameplay giving an outline of a proper session. This includes the mention of an exploration track that determines how much of a site you've explored, as well as a nemesis track that determines how close your main enemy is to you. Site generation has gone into first, involving choosing a site to explore or randomly rolling it, with each site then described on the following pages. This includes things like a high school, a hospital, a palace, the apartment block itself, and clearing some sites may offer minor bonuses. You then determine the temperature in a particular site while you explore it, which can deplete your warmth over time. This can be mitigated with clothes, torches, and so forth. A peril level is given for each site, which can determine how challenging things you face within it are. There are certain numbers of ambush encounters that can be placed into each site, which are randomly determined when you generate the site, and then the exploration sequence follows. During exploration, you generate the room and its features each time, and step into a new place on the fly. Many tables then follow, detailing things you can find or experience in each room based on the location that you're exploring. You then generate the room contents, which can range from anything from finding an item to running into an event or an encounter. Each of the possibilities is given its own table, with discovery given a table as well as events. Encounters are covered separately, although you can encounter either other NPCs or various abominations as you explore. The Devouring has gone into next. It represents the unnatural events that are going on in town and descends every 3 cycles. Its presence requires you to use entirely different site maps for each site. It guarantees encounters when traveling between sites and ups the penalty for death by inflicting a taint upon a character that perishes while the Devouring is active. The various taints are given in their own table, followed by room features that are present during the Devouring only. The Devouring even changes the events that can happen, and can speed up the arrival of your nemesis, inflict emotional distress, or even extend the Devouring for an additional cycle, which I imagine would kind of suck. Each site has its own exploration track, which offers basically improvements such as new talents or other rewards when certain milestones are given. This is incremented every time you successfully complete a site. The Nemesis and the Nemesis track has then gone into, which tracks how close a particularly dangerous and disturbing abomination within Riverdale is from intercepting it. It's essentially a version of your character, but one that's twisted, vicious, and ferocious. The Investigation track is yet another track in order to keep tabs on what you're doing. This one effectively follows your progress through a site. Some investigation within each room represents another check on the track, on the track. It's important to use when deciding which tasks you've been given by NPCs and when you have completed them. Guidelines on puzzles then follow, which are discoveries that you can make in certain rooms. They essentially determine a puzzle level which is rolled against it to solve. Basically, it's a DC to roll against. There is another type of puzzle, though. That's the key puzzle, which involves finding certain items to match with certain keyholes as determined by a random table. You know, for that extra Silent Hill kind of feel. Well, I gotta admit, I rarely played those games. I'll talk about that again near the end. Non-player characters are covered next with a quick way to generate them on the fly, including various attributes and well as appearances, skills, names, motivations, as well as general disposition. There's guidelines on how to handle NPCs in combat, including what they prefer to do. A section on dramatis personae follows, which is more particular personalities, pretty unique NPCs that are covered on their own table, with each NPC given a name, description, as well as what they do each time you meet them. They're more like plot point NPCs that you'd meet in one of these games, so there's that. Of random encounters and terrible foes is a section that details the various enemies. It begins with an introduction, including a brief guideline over the format of each enemy. There's a description of how much trauma is inflicted by the enemy, the size of it, its defense, how many wounds it can take, its bleed threshold in case it is bled, its various attacks, any special abilities and special attacks it has ascended, and if it has an ascended form. There is also some consideration as to whether they are found in groups or not. The first group of enemies that are covered are the Phonoi. They're various nameless abominations that you can stumble on. There's a table to determine the encounter difficulty, the modifiers of a particular Phonoi in question, as well as its tactics table. Then which particular Phonoi is encountered with each individual type described thereafter in a stat block, following the format listed at the beginning of the chapter. Maki creatures are then covered. They are more unique creatures, each with their own description, name, and so forth. So those are basically like your mini-bosses or your bosses. Of fleeting possessions and the means to obtain them is basically the equipment in their gear chapter. It details some various starting gear that all characters start with. It goes over the specific inventory slots the character possesses. Much like computer game might, it covers item sizes, which details how many slots or spaces within a pocket or item that particular thing takes up. This is followed by a section on crafting and crafting supplies. Under Ashen Skies has something called a Soul Forge, which can be used to craft various items or to improve them. This is done by spending crafting supplies or base material. In addition to some of the same currency you would level up with, you can not only improve wearable equipment, but craft various consumables. There's also advanced crafting, which will allow you to craft more advanced specific items. There's a scavenging table that details the items and material that you can find in various rooms. This is followed by a brief description of the various material you can find. And then a table determines the effects of clothing and armor, including the effects on warmth, armor against attacks, as well as how many pockets it might have on it. Instruments of Harm details various weapons and starts with a layout of various weapon qualities as well. There's a sidebar detailing the rules for improvising unarmed attacks. Weapons have damage effects as well as any special qualities they may have. Ranged weapons are covered thereafter and include similar effects to the ones detailed for melee weapons, but also are given consideration for, things like ammunition. There's a brief mention of shrines, which can be built to the various protogenoi, and include their costs as well as their effects. The last main section is a table of darker secrets, which expands the dark secrets table, but is much more visceral, in some cases more troubling, and they may not be suited for all gaming groups, so it's good that they put them in their separate thing. And this is followed by a general index of tables that closes out the book. So, what do I think of Under Ashen Skies? In terms of presentation, it is impeccably produced, although at this point I would not expect anything less of Black Oath. The writing is incredibly well done, atmospheric, and where it covers in-character material, while easily understandable when it covers the rule set. I didn't notice anything in particular regarding minor or even major or minor typographical and technical errors, or even grammatical or spelling errors, so that's good. No typos, etc., which speaks very well of the editing. Indeed, the organization was very easily understandable, although I believe this is because it is yet another entry into an iterative series of semi-solo RPGs produced along the same vein, so every single release seems to get better organized, a little bit more tightly designed, and a little bit, just a little bit better each time, and I can appreciate that. In terms of the overall setting, it seeks to present a sort of survival horror aesthetic, and it does so in spades. I'll have to admit, as I said before, I have very limited experience with survival horror. It's weird because it's a type of game you'd think I'd love, but I've never finished any Silent Hill or Resident Evil or such game, and in truth, I've barely played them. I am familiar with the tropes that go into them, enough that I could identify many of them built into this particular tabletop game, and it will definitely remind you of some of that, some of the inspirational material. There's no doubt about that. I've covered a number of Black Oath Entertainment offerings in the past, and I've noted that quite a few of them would make excellent survival horror games. Under Ashen Skies simply takes a system that already lends itself to that sort of play and just iterates it and focuses it to really hammer home that connection. Mechanically, as I said, it does simply iterate on a system which has been used in prior offerings. It mixes various elements from prior games produced by Black Oath Entertainment that have been tried and true and tested, but it is similar enough in nature to like D20 systems, while being mechanically distinct with simplified combat and on-the-fly procedural generation of sights that still manages to be relatively swift when put to a gameplay test. I didn't see any particularly groundbreaking mechanics introduced in Under Ashen Skies, but that doesn't necessarily become a bad thing, especially for a game initially targeted for solo play. You don't need to reinvent the wheel every time, which is good. I have become fond of this line of solo gaming that is still robust enough to be used as a group or a GM-less type of role-playing game scenario. If anything, I think the introduction of more systems may have actually bogged this one down. It's got, as I said, there seems so many things that you've got to keep track of. That's understandable in a survival horror context, but it can weigh things down a little bit. It's about at the limit of what I care to keep track of during a gaming session. It produces just enough complexity to make the game interesting without going overboard, but I do believe, it's at the limit, and any more additional mechanics, things to track or otherwise, would bog the system down and be a net negative, which is actually kind of sad because I would have liked to see some sort of, I would have liked to have seen some sort of equipment degradation and such in here. But at the same time, there's so much to track already that I would not have wanted to track it. So I don't know, I honestly don't know. I don't take that as a criticism. I honestly don't know what I would have cut in order to put that in. It's kind of a fine line when you're designing a game like this. For what it is, Under Ashen Skies does an extremely good job. And once again, I can absolutely recommend it. If anything, I've just reviewed 3 of these in close order, and this is the best one, honestly, of the 3 that I'm taking a look at. It's just really good. If you're a fan of the survival horror genre, if you're looking for something similar but of a different genre, maybe you probably want to look elsewhere. They do have a number of other systems, as I've said, and many of these systems focus on individual genres and have their mechanics tweaked towards that, so that much is good. I have covered a number of Black Oath Entertainment products in the past, so feel free to check out my other reviews. But anyway, on that note, I'm going to wrap things up here. As always, I will put a link to where you can pick this up below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment, and feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.
And if you are still watching, I would like to take the opportunity to thank my supporters, the top tiers of which are listed on the screen, without whose support I would not have been able to offer the variety of content that I have on this channel throughout the years. If you're feeling particularly generous and would like to join them, you can support the channel. There are a variety of options to do so. I have a Patreon, a Subscribestar, as well as channel memberships enabled. If you are not in a position to contribute, simply leaving a like, a comment, or sharing my videos are all wonderful ways to help the channel grow without spending a dime, and are all greatly appreciated.